has become. In fact, if you see today, the whole of television, the whole of newspaper is on the visit of the Prime Minister, who is having the first state visit in the United States of America. So, sir, actually, it's our great pleasure today, when we are having a G20 summit, to have you as our guest in chief, because you have been an IFS, you have been the former Secretary CPB, UIO, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. We have our ambassador, Ms. Dr. Chakravarti, as whose instance you have come here today. So great, very thankful to you, sir. You had visited our chamber when you were a ambassador designate to Turkey. And just I was talking to you, I think you told me that you have been the ambassador to 3 countries and you have been almost served to different parts of the world, including 3 times to China. You said me you have been. So you, and also, yeah, very grateful today we have the Acting Consul General of Japan amongst us. This is because of the special relationship the India has developed recently with Japan. I mean, a lot of things are happening between India and Japan. So we would also like to know from you as to how you take it and how the relationship will go further. Sir, the people are a lot of concern, because I don't want to speak too much. People want to hear you. There has been a lot of talk whether the world body like United Nations Security Council, then the World Bank, then IMF, whether they require the structural changes in view of the new order which the world is having. I mean, today, what is the purpose of having a United Nations Security Council when it has become a I don't know whether some people say it's a polarized world, some people say it's a bipolar world, and any member of the Security Council has a veto power. Now, with that veto power, does the United Nations Security Council serves any purpose or not? Does it require to have an overall in their rules, regulation, and in their membership? The new world order, as you see that people say that by 2047, India is going to be a developed country. There is a area called Africa, which is the most emerging area in the world. Whether they are to be also included in these world bodies or not as a single country, but as an African Union. What about a continent called South America? I mean, it's such a large continent. I mean, but they have no representation in any of the world body. The views of India on the war between Russia and Ukraine, and the stand of India on Russia-Ukraine stand, and the stand of the other part of the world on the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, where it to take India's to stand of India when naturally the stand of India is not being appreciated by the other developed countries. They don't agree to what India's stand is. But they have not objected to. That is because you have been allowed to import oil from Russia, and there has not been much of an objection to that. That is why, because India's power today, the power of India today, that India has been able to have the oil import from Russia, and this may not have been possible a few years back. I mean, the other which I would like to understand from you, which is very, very important, is the role of the rupee, whether the rupee can be one of the international currencies in the world. Because if you look at the other currencies in the world, I think we have been very stable as far as the rupee is concerned. So in the world order, in today's world order of G20 and the world order of G7, what would be our stand as far as the so whether we would be acceptable as far as to have the rupee part is concerned. I would also like to know, sir, that what we have really achieved when the G20 is going to come to an end in September 2023. It has been going on. We are having number of functions around the year, and in different states, the functions have been held. In fact, it was very encouraging that we had one of the meets in Jammu, Srinagar. I think when we had the meets in Srinagar, which was very encouraging. Now, we had our the chief economic advisor to the government of India was here last week to make a presentation, and according to him, India is going to be a developed country by 2047, and he said it will be by 2047. So, what would be the role of India between 2023 and 2047? Because we are, I don't know whether we are a developing country or we are still underdeveloped country, because there is as far as the poverty is concerned, as well as the malnutrition is concerned, these things are there. We may be having over a $3 trillion GDP, but our per capita income still becomes very, very low, which is just over $2,000. So, and compared to our population, how do we take our per capita income? Because we will come in the category of developed countries only when our per capita income goes above $10,000. I mean, so our target should be, at least in the next 5 years, to have our per capita income to the extent of $5,000. And we can say that safely that, the country is a happy country, and we are going from developing country to the developed country. We have such a formidable prime minister and such a formidable foreign minister. I mean, if you listen to both our prime minister and both our foreign minister in their interview, sometimes you feel very proud that, we have these two persons who are really leading our country. And when you hear our foreign minister, particularly Sri Jaishankar, he really takes whoever is the anchor, he takes him by the shoe by the horn. I mean, he really goes to the points and hits it to the point that what the country is, and what is the diplomatic history of India, and how many powerful people in the world have visited India in last few years. I mean, it has been a unprecedented situation that so many powerful people of the world, powerful statesmen of the world have visited India. And at the same time, the reception which our Prime Minister has received whenever he has gone abroad, that shows how important the India has become. And you being an ambassador, and you being in the Indian Foreign Service for last so many years, there cannot be a much better person to explain us as to what our country has achieved, will achieve, and what is the future that G20 summit will do good to the India. What are the points on which we will do good to the India? And in September, we are going to have, I think, 6 or 7 agreements are going to be signed. I mean, on different issues. There will be an issue in relation to agriculture also, which may not be to the liking of India. I mean, because agriculture trade as far as. So what stand, how would the world take when these agreements are to be executed upon? What should be our stand? Because as I said, when the President Trump was the president, he said America first. And as far as we are concerned, we have to also say India first. I mean, and that is what, whenever you heard the Mr. Jaishankar with the anchor, he said India first. I mean, that has been our policy, and that should be our policy. So we are tackling the world. We say that India first. I mean, we will take our interest first into consideration. This was the stand which was taken on the import of the Russian oils also. And incidentally, sir, we have the from China, we have the Deputy Consul General, I think. Yeah, he's here. So we are fortunate that we have from Japan and we have also from China. So we are looking forward to, and at least, sir, let me tell you that Mr. Rajiv Chakravarti is here. At his instance, we had the Foreign Secretary, Dr. Shringla, who addressed us just before he took G20. And in that meeting, I think, Rajiva, it was about a year back, just before he took G20. He said, you must start a business relationship with 3 countries for the development of particularly Eastern India. And he referred to Nepal, he referred to Bhutan, and he referred to Bangladesh. So therefore, we recently went to Bangladesh about a month back, and we were opening a Bangladesh desk in Bharat Chamber of Commerce to do more business. And we feel that the 21st century will also belong to Africa, which has been an underdeveloped country. So we have opened an African desk in our chamber, so that we can do more and more and relate more and more to the African countries, because that is a virgin country. I mean, whether you take a landmass or whether you take mines and minerals, that's a country which can really serve the world as far as the mineral is concerned, as far as the food is concerned, because of their vastness of the world. I think the China has really looked at country with a lot of interest, and they have done a lot of investment in that country. So we are looking forward to hear from you. I have not read out the speech which the chamber has given it to me, but I thought that these are the few things which. So we have on my left a young boy, Vikram. He is a chairman of the Global Trade Subcommittee. So may I, Vikram, request you to introduce the theme. But may be precise, because everybody wants to hear Sanjay Babu than us,
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya, IFS, retired members of the Chamber, guests and friends. Already the president of our chamber has elaborated in his opening address the theme, but I'll just a little bit repeat certain issues again. It is my most pleasant duty to present the theme of today's special session entitled India Needs the World and the World Needs India, G20 and G7, addressed by Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya, IFS, former Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, as per our guest-in-chief. Friends, effective multilateralism is crucial in the current multipolar world, and policy coordination between multilateral groupings with a focus on the G20 and G7 is necessary to address the challenges faced by the international community. India's opportunity to shape the G20's agenda and hence multilateral governance at the global high table comes at a point of inflection. In the midst of transformative geopolitical, geoeconomic, and technological changes, India calls for inclusiveness, and multilateral diplomacy will be put to test. How national resources can be aligned in the face of diverse national strategies to find global solutions will remain the primary task of G20. In this context, India has a major role to perform. The first is the climate crisis. Failure to meet global targets on emissions and greening runs the risk of climate change overtaking geopolitics and shaping the world order in ways that we simply cannot predict. However, India has made impressive commitments in moving away from fossil fuels to green energy, and its record in protecting its forests, rivers, and environment in general requires appreciation. It is noteworthy to mention that following the pandemic, India's economic transformation is kicking into high gear. The government of India is spending nearly 20% of its budget this fiscal on capital investment, the most in at least a decade. Furthermore, it has been envisioned that countries like India and Vietnam will be big beneficiaries as companies move towards a China plus one strategy. In a multipolar world, India's embracing of a middle path has bolstered its image as a nation with which everyone is interested in having a good relationship. India is positioning itself and using its G20 presidency to do so. I would like to mention that India has developed an external strategy built on multiple alliances and unapologetic self-interest. For example, boosting purchases of Russian oil by 33 times, ignoring pressure from Washington. There are even some signs of pragmatism when it comes to the tense relationship with neighboring China. More than a dozen of Apple's Chinese suppliers are receiving initial clearance from New Delhi to expand operations, underpinning the tech giant's efforts to divert production to India. The incidence of deglobalization has become prominent, but global trade has become stronger than ever. The World Economic Order is trying to locate value chains in more politically predictable places so that geopolitical tensions do not unduly affect the free flow of goods and services. India is definitely a favorable destination, but first it needs to resolve some outstanding questions. One such issue is India's relationship with Europe. A free trade agreement between the European Union and India used to be high on the agenda for both sides, but it was shelved in the mid-2010s. Efforts are being revised to conclude an FTA after a 7-year hiatus. For that, India must open itself in ways that it has resisted in the past to capitalize on the global rearrangement of value chains. Before concluding, I would like to state that the rest of the world has much to gain from a more prosperous, confident, and powerful India. In addition to being the world's most populous country, India also has its largest democracy, and its voice will only grow in importance as its economy develops. With these words, I would conclude my address and request Ambassador Bhattacharya to commence his address, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Khaitan, for this invitation. I would also wish to thank Ambassador Chakravarti for bringing me back to the chamber once again. I also would wish to recognize some of my old friends that I see over here and the Consul Generals of Japan and China. I was told that there is a discussion that's ongoing at the chamber on the G20 issues, and I thought I would pick the subject that we did, which is India needs the world and the world needs India, and the G20 moment in it. Now, this particular theme was not uttered by me in the first instance. In 2017, at the inaugural of the second Raisina dialogue, Prime Minister Modi himself had said these words. And I think he knew at that point of time the way India was proceeding and the way India would exchange and interact with the rest of the world. So I think it's a very apt moment for us, because with G20, a lot of it comes more into being. I think what's also important to recognize is that the agenda for the G20, as set out in terms of the priorities by India, is in some ways an extension of the domestic focus that we have on progress and development. And I think the way we wish for our country and our citizens, we wish for the rest of the world. And so you have an agenda that is inclusive, that is ambitious, and that's action-oriented, quite the way the agenda on the domestic front is as well. We have made significant progress, I think, in the domestic front on, say, for instance, digital public goods, which have brought inclusivity to a great extent. We've shared our benefits with the rest of the world through Vaccine Maitri. And we've also had a very people-oriented approach, and you'll find all these happening in the G20. in the first 6 months of the G20, we've put this into action. We see there's great need for peace and prosperity, both. And these two must happen, not just for us, because we believe we are one large family, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And that's how the maxim of our G20 agenda came out as one earth, one family, one future. And that's the way we wish to go ahead with it. I remember some years ago, this was 2008, we were in Toyako, and Japan was hosting the G8 summit. And at that point of time, there was a mechanism known as the G8 plus. There were 5 additional countries that would be added by rotation. Somehow India was always invited to those meetings. And I remember at that point of time, President Bush and Dr. Manmohan Singh had a conversation at which President Bush told Manmohan Singh that they were planning on having the inaugural session of the G20 summit in a few months, and he invited Dr. Manmohan Singh to it. You know, for a very long period of time, the G7 or the G8 at that time would look after basic financial issues. There were financial crises that were affecting the world, and they would try and work out a formula so that the world would be in stability and in balance. But the G7, G8 had realized that the dynamics of the world had shifted already at that point of time. And it was necessary to go beyond, which is why there was this G8 plus kind of a mechanism, so that there would be broader consultation, democratization of the governance structures. And India was at the core of it. And then, of course, the following year, Obama visited Japan. And in some ways, when Obama talked of his pivot to Asia, the focus on India again came into prominence. And then eventually that process led to, as Prime Minister Abe had said, the confluence of the oceans and what we now have, the Indo-Pacific movement. And I think this is a very important concept that is going to define the future. For us, what it meant was India had arrived, because we were a nation that stood on values and principles, that stood on the aspirations of our citizens, and that we valued the progress that we made, the peace, the contributions to peace and prosperity and stability across the world. Of course, there were many successes later. But if we look at the last few decades, the broad background that we see is that we've been going through an era of transformation. We've seen disruptive technologies which have changed the way we think and act. It has changed the way that our systems work. It has changed the way jobs are. It has changed the way innovations now determine how business decisions can be taken. We've also seen, for instance, that both capitalism and democracy have been challenged. And there have been big changes in the way capitalism and democracy are now exchanging their interactions with their citizens. And the third thing that has happened, and largely because of the technology and the systemic changes and the ability to incorporate that, is that developing countries now find it possible to leapfrog the stages of development. In other words, you can cover up the gap between the developing and developed world much faster. Of course, the prime examples of this were all in Asia, or initially in Asia. We've seen the Asian tigers. We saw the growth of China. And of course, you know, the story of India is well known. What this really shows is that we are moving towards a new gravity that has shifted from the Atlantic towards the Asian continent. And within that, there are many, many players. And I'm so glad you mentioned about Africa, because Africa is not just the youngest continent, but today it is a highly empowered continent. It has resolved many of its old contradictions, which had stayed on because of the era of colonialism. And today, Africa is anxious and waiting to emerge on the world stage. And we must recognize this. In addition to these background developments that have taken place over the last few decades, I also want to share some recent developments which have shaped the way we are today. The COVID pandemic that happened, some call it a black swan, but it was hugely disruptive. But in many ways, it taught us new ways to deal with situation, to be adaptive to the circumstances, and to keep persisting on what we value most and stick to those principles and values. Secondly, of course, we have the war in Ukraine. And in some ways, this has affected supply chains in a very, very serious manner. Food security, energy security, instability in financial markets. I know there are some who are not happy with India's position, but we are in no doubt that India has a principled position that is India's. We have always stood for peace and negotiations. The role of diplomacy must be there. In Bali, Prime Minister worked out an agenda so that there was consensus. And we hope that consensus still endures because India has its own principled position and we will stick to it. And the world at one point of time will realize that this was the way to go ahead. The third recent development is the tendency for growing economic slowdown. And in some parts of the OECD world, there's even recession coming in. So we've got to be very conscious of this as we look at how the world pans out. But in all this chaos and disorder, there is great hope for India. And I call it India is today now in a sweet spot. And this sweet spot has happened because of the dividend of democracy, development, and demography in India. These three have contributed to India in such a significant way that we have an endogenous process that is emerging from within, which is unstoppable. The transformation that is happening in India amongst the young people in the various sectors of the economy is based on its civilization. And this is a march that cannot be stopped. So today, thanks to inclusive growth, which the government has promoted very actively, we are now the fastest growing major economy. We are the fifth largest. We shall be growing further. By 2047, we'll probably be about $30 billion. The Ernst & Young report says about $26 trillion GDP, which will make it a considerable weight. Because although we are over $3.5 trillion today in terms of GDP, as you rightly mentioned, our per capita income is still rather low. So there's still a long way to go. India is acutely conscious that there's much more work to be done, and we'll keep working at it, plugging away at it. What has happened in the last few years in particular is that to supplement the services boom, which had fueled growth across the globe, we are now seeing a resurgence of infrastructure and manufacturing. And that, I think, is extremely encouraging because at the end of the day, the real economy matters a lot. The third trend in India, which puts us in a sweet spot, is that we are now becoming more closely integrated in global supply and value chains. We're also becoming more involved in the R&D, technology, and innovation processes, and combining up with partners across the world. There has been a tendency for capital to move out of China and to go to others. You mentioned about it. But I think more than that, the force of India by itself is enough of a magnet for us to become one of the largest drawers of FDI globally. And this is a trend that can only grow in the days to come. And finally, I think the people in India are extremely optimistic, not just the business community, which it must be, but I think the people of India is optimistic. And this is an optimism that has grown on empowerment. So it is not something that is shallow. It is something because they have learned what the aspirational levels should be, what the rest of the world is achieving, and they have based their optimism on that. What are the emerging trends for India today and into the near future? The first is that trade and investment focus has been multiplied. And I think we should really not just look at the PLIs that we have done, which is helping our manufacturing sector, but also look at outward investments in addition to the inward investments that are coming out. We have our traditional focus on the European and the American and some of the East Asian markets, but I think we are increasingly seeing greater attractiveness of the Gulf and African markets. There are new FTAs that are being signed, and I think this is again an encouraging trend. The second thing that is happening is that we are moving into the next generation of the economy, into the new economy, into technology and innovation. And there we have very strong, stable partnerships based on science and technology with Japan. We have a very large number of scientists and projects that we have in Japan, with US, Europe, countries in Europe, Israel, and Singapore. And with these, what we are now doing is building up a knowledge pool, which will be the bank for the future. For India to grow in the future, we will have to be much more dependent on knowledge that we create and that we create with our closest partners. And what we now see is that we have a very vibrant system where startups are coming up, startups becoming unicorns. We are now getting into the field of fintech and biotech and meditech and edutech. So in other words, we are being able to use this data-driven digital economy in a much more coherent manner. The third way that we are going ahead is the mobility partnerships that we have. You know, for long, India has been a source of people, manpower for the rest of the world. So whether you go to the US or UK, or you go to various other parts of the Gulf, you find Indian talent over there across the range, from highly skilled professionals to semi-skilled people. And we realize that the new economy demands a higher level of skilling. So the government has been going about signing mobility partnerships in different forms with different partners where there can be better movement of skilled professionals. And we've had many of these with countries in the European Union, with UK, with Japan, with Mauritius, and these supplement, as you know, the labor agreements that we have in many of the countries where we have relatively semi-skilled and low-skilled people. And of course, we still remain the highest recipients of H-1B visa in the United States. So mobility is going to become a big issue. Remember, in the WTO, this Mode 4 was a big, big problem. So India is now dealing with this on a bilateral basis. The fourth element that has happened is that, unfortunately, the multilateral processes have not really moved quite in the manner that they could. And I was talking particularly of the economic front, where the WTO has fallen short of its expectations. It has happened also, as you mentioned, in some of the other institutions, in the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions. I must say that all these institutions have done, the UN, Security Council, the World Bank, IMF, WTO, they've done a marvelous job. But they were formed on a reality which was after the Second World War. Today, those realities have changed, but the people who control or govern these institutions haven't been able to change their outlook. This change will have to come about because, after all, how can you have a system where the largest democracy is not represented on that table to help? As you know, there is a move for the reform of the UN and the Security Council in particular. There are many working changes that have happened in the other institutions as well. But this has led India towards more plurilateral arrangements. And this is not just India. We've seen this across the world where plurilateral arrangements have become more popular. So today, for instance, we are much more closely engaged with our neighbors through BIMSTEC and other measures, through our Look East, Act East policy with ASEAN, the EAS process, the East Asia Summit process. And then we have a very active partnership with some of our closest partners, with RIC, the Russia, India, China initiative, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And then we have these emerging countries like BRICS and IBSA, which are working together. And as I was saying earlier, the most significant development that has happened in recent times, the Indo-Pacific. And I think in many ways, as I was saying earlier as well, the Indo-Pacific will determine the future of the world. And through all this, we've been much more closely engaged in global governance issues. We've been very actively participating and speaking for the global south. So what is the G20 opportunity for us? As you know, the G20 has been in existence for a long time, and our governor of the central bank has been participating in this for well over 2 decades, working essentially on financial stability issues. But then, as I said, it was realized that it was necessary to take it to the summit level and therefore work on both the political security front as well as the economic front. And as you know, there are these 2 tracks in the G20. What we have tried to do, and the process is ongoing, and as you know that the process in G20 is very democratic and consensus driven, and we've had outstanding cooperation from all the partners in G20. We'd worked very closely with the Indonesians when they were in the chair, and now we get the support of all the other countries as well. So the first thing that we've been trying to do is to shape the global economic agenda. And in this, we have been able to take a key role in shaping and addressing the key challenges and opportunities on inclusive growth, on sustainable development. And in this, we've again, as I had said right at the outset, relied greatly on our own experience in the domestic field, because we have made tremendous progress in these areas. Climate change is an issue on which there is a lot of contention and a lot of slippages, but this is an ongoing process that we wish to engage as well. This year, we hosted the Global Food Security Conference, and I think in some ways what this has done is address this issue of security of food. This affects the poorer people much more than it affects anyone else. And therefore, it is important to discuss and realize that there is a food crisis and that agriculture needs better investment and incentives. And this is something that will go on. The second issue that we've been very closely engaged in is in digital transformation. We have been rather fortunate that our government has been able to develop a series of digital public goods, whether it is Aadhaar, which is an identity document, or it is the UPI system, or the Trinity through which we assign the bank accounts and provide for seamless connectivity and transactions. And this is now something that has become an attractive option in the rest of the world. So India's digital public goods are something that is going out in a big way. The infrastructure for this is something that we have to provide for, and therefore all of us need to work together. And then secondly, there are the issues of governance. And what are the rules that are going to determine data security, data privacy, and data transferability? And so there are 2 platforms on which we are working. There is, of course, as you know, there's a Global Governance Committee, which is under the UN Secretary General, which is working on data governance. But we at the G20 are trying to supplement those efforts so that within the G20, there is better understanding on this issue. The digital economy is at the core of this. Thankfully, when we met in Hiroshima, and the G7 plus meetings took place, one of the very important outcomes of that was on the cybersecurity initiative. So we are very pleased that through the action of the G7, we were able to bring out this consensus. The third one is in strengthening international cooperation. And this is how we build consensus, forge partnerships, promote policy coordination, and we foster economic and financial stability. Now, as you are very well aware, the Ukraine issue has brought about a certain differentiation within the G20 community on that particular issue. But the good news is that on everything else, there is an amazing degree of consensus that we see. And so we will continue to work towards all those issues and promote collaboration. The fourth issue is of fostering growth and development. And this is particularly important because we are not just a developing country. but we, in a sense, also share the responsibility for many of our partners across. And we realize that we need to have policies that can attract investments, that can create jobs. We have to look at what the future of jobs are, how skilling has to be done, how infrastructure has to be built for those future jobs, and how the role of innovation has to be structured in. So in other words, what we are really being able to do at this G20 this year with our key partners is to bring about a future-oriented approach that is more acceptable and more meaningful and delivers more. The fifth issue is of global trade. As you know, we've had the multilateral negotiations, the ministerial held last year in Geneva was very successful on many counts. There are still many issues regarding how we can promote an inclusive and balanced trade agenda and a trading system that has those values. So we are currently engaged with our partners in promoting that. This year in particular, the trade ministers have had good success, particularly on IPR issues and on digital trade. As you know, digital trade is going to become an increasingly larger share of trade volumes as we move ahead. So I think this future orientation is something that we've been able to do very commendably with the support of all our partners in the G20. The sixth item that we have put big focus on is on sustainable development and connect to that of climate change. The focus for us had been on renewable energies. As you know, we have set up the International Solar Alliance, to which all the G20 partners are now supportive. And there are a very large number of countries across the world, because that then sets up the agenda for how we can deal with the greenhouse gas emission issue. We set up a special task force on the green hydrogen task force to accelerate the use of hydrogen fuel. And in this, we have relied heavily on the great advances made in many of the G20 countries. The key to the climate change issue, of course, for most of the developing world is about how we fund and provide technologies for adaptation and mitigation issues. This is a very difficult task, let me admit. But I think we are trying to bridge the gaps so that there is greater sense of commitment. In some ways, ironically, Europe is now beginning to slip back on its commitments to the greenhouse gases. And we hope that, they will pick up their commitments. They're switching over from Russian gas to fossil fuels, and that is making a bit of a change. The seventh item is on strengthening financial stability. This has been the bedrock on which the G7, G20 used to actually work. This was the financial stability issues. And as you know, the governors of the reserve, the central banks, our reserve bank, and the finance ministers used to head this, and they continue to do that. We've been faced with systemic risks. And, in the introduction, I'd mentioned that capitalism has faced challenges, because capitalism, while it has continued, has led to supernormal profits, as one would say, leading to the exclusion of large communities of the citizens and leading to large inequities. While this is a very good capitalist outcome, it is something that, most countries would find it difficult, and it leads to certain levels of discomfort. What our finance track people have been able to do is to bring about the launching of the debt service suspension initiative. This is something that is going to help about 50 highly indebted countries across the world, particularly the developing countries. And therefore, this is one of the things that we should be rightfully proud of in the G20 for having brought about this understanding. We've also been able to bring about, through our own experience and sharing, the financial inclusion, the digital finance, and some of the emerging technologies in this area. And finally, before I move to the last point, I should just mention about the rupee issue that you mentioned. I think what we've seen over the years, and this is an ongoing trend really, is that Ever since we moved away from the gold standard, which was several decades ago, the dollar had become the proxy for the gold standard. And over time, what we found is that the basket of currencies that any country would use, both for its reserve as well for its valuation of its own currency, was becoming a more diverse basket. And so there were many other hard currencies in addition to the US dollar that would be considered. So they would typically include, the euro, the UK pound, the Swiss franc, the Japanese yen, and many others. And so the basket of currencies is now increasing. So automatically, the share of the dollar had been going down. But what we've also found in recent times is that there is now a tendency towards trading in local currencies. BRICS, for instance, is an organization that had done this several years ago, and we had started a pilot project, and which is now expanding within the BRICS countries. There is now greater interest among some of the other countries when they trade with BRICS countries to use that kind of a local currency mechanism. So I think this is the trend of things. But at the end of the day, what we need is that when we have a system for international settlements, as you know, that's done out of Basel at the Bureau of International Settlements, we need to have a coherent and coordinated approach that all the central bank governors and finance ministers are comfortable with. The last thing that I wanted to mention about our G20 priorities was the global south. And I think the increasing levels of development and growth in the developing countries has led to this empowerment and democratization of the global structures. And in response to that, and in line with the way India always is, we invited 9 countries to join the G20 process this year, including our neighbor Bangladesh over here and others, to become part. They're all major they're emerging economies. And so there is greater salience for including more people on the table so that you can hear their voices and coordinate them so that you have a better coherent approach that is going to be applicable to all. The Prime Minister recently wrote to all G20 heads of state calling for a permanent place for the African Union, recognizing the very significant role that Africa plays. So in other words, I think what India has been able to do is to give a voice to the global south. And Prime Minister had, as you know, chaired the Voice of Global South summit in January, soon after we took over the G20 presidency at the end of last year. It involved about 125 countries. And in many ways, I think this is going to bring about the democratization and the governance structures that is so sorely needed. And I think although the process of the UN, UNSC, and others might continue, if the UN does not change its ways and methods and its representation and its democratization, the UN will lose its relevance. It has been a wonderful organization. It has contributed enormously on both legs, on peace and security, as well as on development. But if it does not change, and if there are people who hold back the UN from that change that the UN so desperately wants, they will become out of place as well. So I should now come up to my conclusions and look at what we can look ahead to. The first is, I think this is a really good time for India. We are on the roll. So I would say that we should really take advantage of this situation, these favorable conditions. In China, my friends say "chua ji hui," which is seize the opportunity and go ahead. So we should really do that. The second is that I think we need a great focus on the manufacturing sector. This is something that has been deficient. And for that, the government has initiated a number of programs in which we can scale up our manufacturing sector so that we can become globally competitive, so that we produce the best products. And this is extremely important. And that will then be able to mesh us closely into global supply and value chains. And once we are part of that, I think the position of India, which is already growing, will become much more consolidated. The third thing that I would wish to urge is that we need to really focus on new era technology and innovation. If we don't look at the future and only look at the past, we will probably get left behind again. So we have to be ahead of the curve. We've seen many economies which are small states, small economies, but extremely competitive and extremely energetic and dynamic. And that's because they're ahead of the curve. The next point is, we are today, as you know, negotiating a new round of FTAs with a set of countries. I would urge chambers like yours and all others in business to engage much more closely with the government and the negotiating teams, because FTAs should be negotiated not with the view to the past, but with the view to the future. What is it? The FTA is going to come into effect N years from now. So what is it that my economy will be like N years from now? What is it that we would be able to leverage N years from now? That is what you got to look at. So when you have your consultations with government and the negotiators who will be doing this on behalf of the country, please look at that, because we must have, again, a future-oriented approach. I am convinced that globalization and multilateralism will only deepen. And I think that is the way we believe the world should be. In my system, in my thinking, everyone counts, every citizen counts. And therefore, in the global community, every country must count. And that's the way it has to be. Again, I go back to the salience of the Indo-Pacific. I think that is the future. I think it is an open, free, transparent mechanism which has various facets of political security, development, cultural contacts. It provides the bridge with the African continent. You know, Prime Minister has developed this idea of Sagar, which is security and growth for all in the region. So we need to kind of understand this idea of the Indo-Pacific much more deeply, because it's going to become much more relevant as we take all decisions, particularly business decisions. And if we look at Bengal in particular, I would say that the three key partners that we could really look at is Bangladesh, right next to us, which is a buoyant economy, which today is much more focused on one product exports, but it will have the ability to diversify. Bangladesh is also a rapidly growing economy, which will reach the developed country status perhaps by 2041. The second country to look at is really Japan, because the kind of affinities that we have with Japan are very, very deep. Japan is deeply engaged in our development process. We've had a very old partnership. And the third is, please look at Africa. This is your market of hope for the future. And you will find a very receptive audience in Africa. The amount of goodwill that there is for Africa, that is there in Africa for India, is unbelievable. And primarily it has happened because the doctors who treated them and the teachers who taught them were both Indian. So we have an amount of goodwill that is unbeatable. It's almost like having mother's love. So I think I would wish to conclude with that and say that today we are in a situation in India where India has grown. We still have a long way to go, but today India is more able and more willing to play her due role in the global community. Thank you very much.
At least I can say with authority that I have learned a lot of things today from your talk. What is G20 is all about? What were the agenda of G20? What would be the future which India will gain after the G20 summit? All these issues which you have referred to as the financial stability, green hydrogen, digital trade, global trade. I mean, the food security, the digital transformation, digital security, cyber security, international cooperation, make our manufacturing, make in India strong. The conflict between the capitalism and democracy and the inequality it also brings. One earth, one family, one. The whole issue is, sir. As you rightly said, what is good for India, and particularly you being a Bengali, you also touched upon what is good for Bengal. How do we? And as I rightly said, that we are on the right path because we have today Bangladesh desk and we have an Africa desk. Sir, you would be happy to note that we celebrate Africa Day every year. And for last few years, we celebrate Africa Day every year. And we invite ambassadors from many African countries to come down to Calcutta and to speak. So we know that for Bengal, these two areas are very important. We have not been able to interact much with Japan, though I have presented to your Consul Generals here that at your Consul General's residence, I have made a presentation on investment in West Bengal. This was few years back, 4 or 5 years back, at your residence. That why should not the because Japanese companies has not come to West Bengal much. There are hardly 3-4 companies, and 1 or 2 companies are client of ours. But Japan has more gone into south. They have the large investments in Karnataka, then they have in Western, but they have not come. I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of questions to ask to you, but my first question to you would be, I would like to start because lately, sir, I have had the opportunity to attend some of the international conferences where I was one of the main speakers. And in those international conferences, it was basically in connection with law students and things like that. But not only confined to law, but also for the investments in India. And when I interacted with those students, all young students, they had gone to England to study, they had gone to America to study. I asked them one question that where would you like to, after you study, where would you like to live and where would you like to work? More than half of them told me that they would like to work in the country in which they have studying now. They would not like to come back to India. And in fact, the Chief Justice of India in one of the conferences, he went on to say that, and he had come back, it was in London, that he had come back from California on the same day when he addressed us. And he said that 1/3 of the one-third of the industries in Silicon Valley is either funded or founded by Indians. When I was in Dubai, there was a question that somebody asked that which Indian city you see is the most developed Indian city. And he named Dubai. He did not name Bombay. He did not name Calcutta. He said Dubai is the most favorite Indian city. And the reason is that 1/3 of the total population of Dubai is Indian. So the world, as you rightly said, yesterday, last week, India Today, they had a conference in Kerala. And they said, we receive, as you said, that $100 million remittance, $100 million remittance has come to India, the largest remittance ever. And they said we received 35,000 crores rupees as a remittance last year in Kerala. So India, the population of India is moving globally. People are setting up and putting up industry globally. There's nothing wrong in it. I think if we want Japan to come to India, if we want USA to come to India, why not India should go to other countries? But the issue is, a lot of people I mean, there was a recent study that 63,000 billionaires, not in the dollar terms, but in Indian rupees term, are going to move out of India, and which is happening in last many years now. People are moving out of India, and one of the reasons why people are moving out of India are two reasons: ease of doing business and ease of living. I mean, both are difficult in India. I mean, we speak India is developing, India is growing, India is the fastest growing economy in the world. But there is a general perception that our ease of living is difficult and our ease of doing business is difficult. I can go and elaborate. I don't want to go into all those aspects. We need to look into that. That you don't find Americans taking up Indian citizenship. But why do Indians, I was talking to a chartered accountant the other day, and I asked him, what is your specialization? And he said, sir, I don't specialize in accountancy. Then I asked him, then what do you specialize in? He said, I specializing in finding Indians to settle abroad, to give them the citizenship of few countries he named. He said, I specialized in that particular job. So I said, do you have a lot of clients? I said, yeah, I have a lot of clients. I mean, they want to move out to India, move out of India. I think, as you rightly said, that, FTA, free trade agreement, we are fighting with this free trade agreement with England. And I am a connoisseur of Scotch whiskey, so I can tell you that we have become the largest consumer of Scotch whiskey in the world. We have overtaken China, we have overtaken France, and one. So the point in issue was that they wanted less of taxation as far as the import of Scotch whiskey is concerned. As far as the England was concerned, we want to have. But we have been able to do a lot of free trade agreement with UAE. It has been a fantastic free trade agreement. In fact, I was in UAE in their signing ceremony of the free trade agreement, because it is better to have a free trade agreement bilaterally with different each countries, because you must have seen in the newspaper the other day that we have, by the European Union, a lot of items have been taken off from the preferential treatment. They have become more and more expensive for us to, particularly the leather goods, which is going to affect us badly as far as the Bengal is concerned. A lot of items have been taken up. So therefore, these are the areas naturally we'll have to take. But G20 has done a lot of good. There is no doubt about it. But I thought that these two areas are very important area where India needs to do better as of ease of living and ease of doing business. I think these two areas are very important, because you keep on interacting with the government authorities. We also say many times on these two issues. I mean, with these words, I would leave the house open and I will start from the left if people would like to, but be short and brief on your question.
I'll be more shorter and brief.
Yeah.
Sanjay, this is Professor Alok Kumar, if you remember me. First is that
introduce yourself, sir.
First is that it's I would not call it a talk, it's a deliberation, and it is the future, because what you said were all in bullet points. All your talk was in bullet points. So I take up one of your bullet points, that is on capitalism. You said that it is being challenged. If you could just slightly elaborate on that. You just touched it and went away. I'm particularly interested in that.
Yes, he will do that. After your question, he will do that. Let me ask other questions, because you want an elaboration.
Yeah, I'll take other questions.
Yeah, okay.
But you did introduce yourself. I said it is necessary for you to introduce yourself.
I introduced myself. I said.
I didn't hear that. Anyway, any other from that side left? Any other person? Sir, I think he's the lone person to ask questions. So on capitalism, he wanted to know. Yeah.
Thank you. So, I think India is a work in progress. And we've done, I think, rather well on various fronts. But there's still a lot of work to go. And I think we are fairly candid about it. We realize that, our aspiration is not to have an economy that is $2,000+ per capita income, but we really wish to go ahead. And we will. I think the stage is set for that. I live in Delhi, which is said to be the most polluted city. But the other day, we were quite amazed that the city of New York was more polluted than us. But of course, for Delhi, it's a systemic problem. Ease of doing business and ease of living are extremely important. I agree with you entirely. And this is something that we have to work on, particularly if we want quality of capital to come in. When we want foreign capital, today India is in a situation where I think out of the gross capital formation, just about 8% is foreign. The rest of it is all domestic. But what it does, it brings with it the foreign capital. It brings with it a new culture, and it brings a new technology and a new way of doing things. For instance, I remember when Suzuki came to India, it brought with it uniforms that people would wear, exercises that, workers and managers would do together. And I think it develops a certain culture, and I think we need that as well. So one of the things that the government, of course, I don't speak for the government anymore since I retired 5 months ago, but, I sometimes drift into that mode. But one of the things that the government has been trying to do is to reduce the compliance burden. And reducing the compliance burden is extremely important because the number of forms that you have to fill up, the number of inspections that you have to do are sometimes way too onerous. And therefore, it's not just the ease of setting up business, but the ease of running a business. When you want to kind of set up a new thing for an existing business or expand the kind of problems that you have to face. So I think those are all things that are there in the back of the mind of the government, and, attention is being paid. The standard of living, I think, has changed enormously over the years, but there's still a lot that can be done. I think as the prosperity level grows, as the empowerment levels grow, the people will demand more, the citizens will demand more, and that will then be provided. But I think also some proactive steps must be taken. You mentioned about how these people go overseas and then they stay abroad. And, we have a diaspora, we call them diaspora, persons of Indian origin who live overseas. Pravasi, we call it.
Bharati Pravasi.
Yeah, we call it Pravasi, which is actually a better term in my thinking, of about 31 million. 18 million of these are what we call persons of Indian origin who got citizenships of other countries, and 13 million are Indian citizens. So they are NRIs, so to say. And there was a point of time, I remember when I was a student doing my master's, when we used to talk about brain drain. All this talent is going out, which is true. But actually today, in a sense, they become the brain trust. And in many ways, they contribute to the global system. And since we are so much more interconnected, it also helps us in the process. And of course, there are some who also come back directly and contribute to the national development effort. So it all kind of goes around. What I think the state wishes to do and tries to do is to create an environment where you promote excellence. And then excellence, like water, will find its own path and settle down wherever it has to. And it'll continue to contribute and give the sweetness of water as it does. And so these Indians who go overseas will also do the same. And of course, sometimes there are bad eggs who go out as well. So that's also not such a bad thing. But I understand, I think our diaspora policy is something that is also evolving. There is a great aspiration amongst the diaspora to be more closely associated with the national development effort. And we've seen this because I used to hold that charge when I was back in the ministry. And I used to engage with various diaspora groups across the world. And this aspiration has grown, this wish to be part of India, to be part of the motherland, to go back to the roots has grown enormously. And they come up with outstanding ideas. And there are ways in which we do it. So I don't know if that kind of adds to the discussion, but I thought I should share that with you. The point that you mentioned about, the crisis or challenge to both capitalism and democracy, in many ways, we were coming up in a system where there were these two political ideologies of democracy and socialism. I mean, they're not necessarily different, but, democracy and communism, socialism. And then on the other hand, you had the planned system and the market system. The market system being the capitalist system. And I think what we have found in our experience in India, and we can only speak for that, is that for us, democracy has been an extremely good exercise. But what we have also seen is that democracy has faced challenges across the world. In many cases, democracies have been overturned and, dictatorships have come about. Military dictatorships, autocracies. And while they might seem to be good for that system, for us, the citizen is extremely important. And for us, therefore, democracy works. The capitalism issue, on the other hand, is something that is relatively new for us because, we were largely a planned economy for a very long period of time till our policy of reforms and liberalization came about. And once that happened, I think we started moving towards a more market-oriented economy. And I think our experience has been extremely good. But if you look at the experience of capitalism across the world, and if you see, for instance, the works of Piketty, who got the Nobel Prize for this as well, is that capitalism has a tendency to promote new goods, promote innovation, technology. It brings about efficiencies, but it also leads to concentration. So it often leads to monopolistic tendencies, which in a sense, for our clashes with our democracy, in a sense. What it also leads, as I was saying, is to inequities in society, which is natural, because unless there is inequity, you will not have surplus for investments. And we realize that investments are the core of the way forward. But it also leads sometimes to such sharp inequities that the gaps become very, very wide. And I think the experience that I was referring to was more global rather than India, because I think the Indian experience of both democracy and capitalism has been more positive than other way around. But if you look at the global experience, there have been questions. When you have a financial crisis, for instance, the way we had the crash in Wall Street, then it affects a lot of people very adversely who are probably more marginalized. And because they hadn't even the knowledge or the information, because the asymmetries of information are so much more acute in a capitalist system. Of course, they can be much more acute in an autocratic or state-planned system as well. But it affects, because over here, you are actually concerned about the people, right? Whereas you're not just thinking about the system. So in that sense, there have been challenges to capitalism. But at the end of the day, as I had said, we in India have put our faith in both democracy and development through the market route. And I think it stood us in good stead. So we should be pleased with it. All systems need constant reviews. We should never believe that what we've created is the best thing possible. So we should listen to feedback, listen to people, come back with their ideas, work it out, have a brainstorming session, and then you can have a better model. And then that better model can become even better day after tomorrow. So I think that's the context in which I was talking about the challenges to democracy and capitalism, although both are things that have stood India in very good stead.
Thank you so much.
Nareshji,
I had one question. Sorry.
Okay, go ahead, ask question.
I mean, today, most of the international trade is still done in US dollars. But as countries like India and all grow, they develop much faster. Do you see gradually that the dependence of trade on the dollar going down, and maybe, there will be a stage where more and more trade we are doing in the Indian rupee? And then how does that get accepted in the world?
So, as you know, there are these two current account and the capital accounts which are involved. And we've already seen that on the capital account, there has been a much broader spread of currencies. And I'd given certain examples as well in different organizations. Some of these have become local currencies, as they call it, have become more popular. But I think on the current account, you're right. The dollar still is. In fact, even on the capital account, if I remember right, it's about 76% is still US dollar denominated. And on the current account, it's much higher. Over a period of time, you will find that there will be ways in which other currencies become more popular. You are probably familiar that recently there was a debt crisis that the United States faced because of the limits that it has on its debt ratio. And then Biden, in fact, had to go back from Hiroshima. He couldn't go to Australia. He had to go back from Hiroshima back to DC to speak with the Congress to work out a deal so that it would not fall into that debt trap. And there were fears that they might actually be downgraded, the United States. So while that is happening on the one hand, the other currencies are still not in such a situation where they command that share of a global economy that they become a dominant thing. So if you look at the Indian trade, I think we are about 1.5% of global trade, which is a very small amount. So it would take some time before we can do that. But what is possible is that we can have bilateral understandings where we can have bilateral trade which is denominated in rupee or local currency. And as you know, we already have several such arrangements. There are other ways that are also emerging. For instance, your RuPay card today, which is through an Indian UPI, essentially you spend rupees and it's accepted in a number of countries today. So there is a greater acceptability of currencies, non-dollar currencies, so to say. But I think we've got to make our economy much bigger and increase our trade much more before we can put rupee into the forefront. Also, we must realize that once we do this, your rupee, my rupee, will become much more susceptible to global trends. So the relative stability that we have enjoyed today might become imperiled because somebody may not be able to pay back, somebody has other problems. So it's something that I think we need to go ahead with some caution. And I would think only after we've acquired a certain volume, a certain scale, both in terms of share of GDP as well as in share of trade.
Thank you.
Ambassador Bhattacharya, Ambassador Chakravarti, members of the chamber, guests and friends. At the end of this special session, India needs the world and the world needs India in the context of G20 and G7. It is my pleasure and privilege to propose a hearty vote of thanks to our guest-in-chief, Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya, IFS retired, former Secretary CPV and OIA, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, for sparing some of its valuable time and addressing the members of the chamber once again after 5 years. It was indeed an enlightening session, Ambassador. India's G20 presidency marks a watershed moment in the country's history. Besides the Indian economy being larger than 3 member countries of G7, India's engagements with the G7 are imperative to address the challenges the group is facing, especially in regard to global geopolitical and economic epicenter shifting to the Indo-Pacific, as you mentioned. India is indeed playing an important role by finding pragmatic global solutions for the well-being of all the nations. Sir, in the context of food, you will be glad to know that food is very important area for a chamber as well. We are especially promoting qualitative and safety of food from exports suitability and working closely with the ministry. And in fact, very soon we shall be having a special session with FASSAI as well. My special thanks are, thank you, sir, for once again for sharing your perspectives. My only question that I had, the gentleman asked the same question, and you so very, very eloquently described it. My special thanks are due to Ambassador Sarvajit Chakravarti, Honorary Chairman of the Bharat Chamber Africa Desk, for his support and coordination in organizing today's session. With these words, I request you all to join me in carrying a hearty vote of thanks to Ambassador Bhattacharya with appreciative acclamation. Thank you. And sir, small, to momento. This is beautiful. Yeah. Thank you. This is lovely.